look at a bird today. That's spectacular. All right. Hey guys, what's up? It's Maisie with Barbecue by Maisie. If this is your first time to the channel, thank you so much for checking it out. And if you're coming back, I truly appreciate the support. Please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that bell so you're notified of all future videos. Today we are making beef ribs. I have been drooling just looking at this meat in my fridge. I am so excited to get it on my smoker this morning. I'm going to take you through the whole process from trimming the meat all the way throughout the cook, and then of course at the end, you know I've got to try it. Today I am smoking on my Pit Boss Brunswick at about 270 degrees, but really you could go anywhere from 225 to 300, and I have competition blend pellets loaded up and ready to go. All right, so I'm not going to waste any time. I'm going to jump right into trimming these ribs and we're going to get them on the smoker. This is our untrimmed beef rib. Right here you're going to see is some silver skin. That is not going to render. So we want to make sure we get that removed. This fat right here is kind of hard anyways. It's not going to render very well. Not all fat is bad. There is fat that's going to render and really going to make these ribs nice and moist and yummy. So I am going to leave some of it, but this silver skin and this harder fat I'm going to remove. Now to remove the silver skin, get under this top layer. And it's really easier to work with if your meat is cold right out of the fridge, and you're just going to work your way to the edge. I'm going to try and remove as little meat as possible. So you can kind of see right here, you've got this silver skin piece. We've got a little bit of meat, so I'm just going to slowly work my way back. Now I'm into a little bit of a fat cap here. And you can see under here, as I pull up this piece right here, you can still see that we are removing silver skin. So I'm just going to keep going. And we're just going to slowly work our way across the rib and remove all this stuff that we don't want. So I've moved you over to my second rack of ribs that I have already trimmed. You can see that there's still a little bit of silver skin. It's not necessary to get it completely all the way off. Got most of it off. And you can see I trimmed a lot of this fat off. You can see all through here this really good marbling. All that fat is just going to render and make this rib just so good. I am using a hot sauce as a binder, but you could use anything. You could use oil, mustard, you know, that W sauce. This is just going to give it, I mean, you're really not going to be able to taste the heat too much, but it's just going to give it a little bit of a different flavor. Rub that all around. This is so that your rub is going to stick to the meat. Now I want to note that on beef ribs, there is this membrane on the back. When it comes to the membrane on beef ribs, some people like to remove it, but I have found that leaving it on is going to help hold everything intact. That membrane on the beef ribs is really holding all of these ribs together. Now, when you're cooking something like pork ribs, removing it, I personally think makes it taste better. I don't like to eat that membrane on pork ribs. But when it comes to beef ribs, I just think that it's a little bit different and it is actually serving a purpose. I personally don't see any reason to season this side, so we're just going to leave it. The first thing I'm going to do is season it well with some coarse kosher salt. And this is a big chunk of meat. You can really season it pretty heavily. I like to do the salt first so I can see how much I've got on there. Don't forget the sides of your ribs. Next I'm going to use just it's a beef rub that I like from Pit Boss. I'm gonna go pretty heavy because this is a big, thick piece of meat here. This one is just going to be it's really just basically a nice pepper rub. Quick note about the rub you use, try and find one that's a little lighter on the sugar, because for this cook, we're essentially not really going to wrap it the entire time. So that sugar, when it's in the smoker, it has a tendency to burn if it's in there for a long period of time. That's just something to kind of keep an eye out for when you're trying to select a rub for your beef ribs. I'm gonna pat that in. All right, so this rack is ready to go on the smoker. All right, so we have got the rack of ribs. I am going to just put it right here on our second shelf of the Brunswick. the bone side down, meat side up. We're going to let these smoke for about 3 hours untouched, and then at that point we're going to start spritzing them. The reason you want to wait and not immediately start spritzing them is because you really want to let your bark set first. If you start spritzing too early, you're just going to wash off all that seasoning you just put on. So at about 2.5 to 3 hours, we'll check it, make sure our bark has set, and then we will start spritzing. Okay, so you guys know where I am off to. I've got a Diet Coke with my name written all over it, so I'll see you back out here in about 3 hours. All right, we're at the 3-hour mark, so now I'm just going to kind of touch the bark, and it's still a little soft and coming off on my finger, so I'm going to wait until we spritz it, but the ribs are coming along really good. Those bones are starting to poke out. These ones over here, so all right, so I've just got a spray bottle here, and I'm just going to spray the tops of this meat now. That bark was able to get set a little bit more. So now that we've started spritzing, we're going to spritz every 45 minutes to an hour. Now, when it comes to spritzing, obviously there's a ton of different options. I just keep it simple and go with water. I personally don't think that the spritz on this is going to add a ton of flavor, but you could do something even like with a hot sauce if you want to kind of give it a little spice. You know, beef broth, apple cider vinegar, there's tons of options. That's something where you just are going to go with what your personal preference is. All right, another hour has passed. We've got our spray bottle with water. We're just going to spritz that meat. We'll be back out in another hour. So how do you know when your beef ribs are finished? You can always cook to a temperature. I think the temperature is a great guide to know when they are getting close to being done, but really a meat thermometer with a probe is what is going to ultimately help you know when they are completely ready. When the ribs are at about 203, 205 is when I'm going to start probing them for tenderness. If this probe is not going in like through butter, then they're not ready. Leave them on. They can keep going. They can go up into the 210s, even higher if you need. It's really important to not get impatient there at the very end, because you really want to make sure that your beef ribs are tender. Don't try and rush that process. And when you're probing for tenderness, go all around the beef rib. Don't just do one spot. One spot might be super tender, but somewhere might not be quite as tender. And there's no point in pulling it off before the whole rack of ribs is nice and tender. This is our rack of ribs I put on very first, and it's probing in the 200s pretty consistently. There's some areas that are super tender, like just probing right through butter. Up here, it's a little bit tighter. So since that one is super close to being finished, what I'm going to do is pull both racks of ribs off of the smoker. I'm going to wrap them in butcher paper and stick them on and just let them finish wrapped a little bit. We are so close, but I don't want to rush the end of this. So let's go ahead and get them both wrapped. That one's going right back on the smoker, and we will do the same with the second rack. As far as wrapping your beef ribs goes, I know it's tempting to wrap those beef ribs at like 165 when you think you may have hit the stall, but I think if you let it go beyond that and even possibly don't wrap, you're really gonna get that much better of a bark. But if you want to, wait until it's later in the cook, about 190, 195, and make sure you're not wrapping in foil. Be sure you have butcher paper. When you wrap in foil, it can kind of damage that bark you've spent so much time working on. The butcher paper allows it to breathe, and you're going to be able to keep your bark that way. So once you've determined that those beef ribs are ready, they're nice and tender and ready to come off the smoker, hallelujah, hallelujah. At that point, if you haven't already wrapped them, wrap them in butcher paper because you're going to let them rest. So our rack of ribs is probing like butter. We're gonna get it off the smoker, wrap it in a blanket, and put it in an empty cooler to rest before we slice it. Now the resting period is just as important as the rest of the cook. It's tempting to rush through that part. Just make sure you plan your cook so that you have time for rest. I would say at least 30 minutes, but ideally the rack of ribs gets to rest for an hour before slicing. Okay guys, we've got our beef ribs here. They got about a 45-minute rest. I pulled them out a little sooner because I want to make sure I had light to show you guys, but let's slice into them and see how they look. All right, to slice into these ribs, I'm gonna flip it over. I'm gonna start right here. Oh my goodness, so tender. Oh boy, that is just falling right apart. These are incredibly tender. You can just see, I mean, this is just super, I'm gonna say it is extremely moist. That marbling in there has just made an incredible piece of beef here. It's just juicing up. Cannot wait to eat these. Can't take this anymore. I'm gonna just go straight and bite a bite out of it. Is that okay? Oh my gosh. Holy spinoli. You guys, I can't even explain to you how delicious these are. Seriously, I think it's a meat and barbecue that everybody needs to at least try once in your life. If you need to splurge on it, splurge on it. It's so good. Honestly, it's just a fun cook. There's not much to it. And if you're patient, you're gonna get such tender ribs. That one rib, the middle rib, which is basically just fell off of the bone. You can have this amazing food right at home. How insane is that? All right, well, I am not going to make my family wait any longer. Thank you so much for hanging out with me today, guys. I truly appreciate it. If you enjoy my content, please consider subscribing to my channel and hitting that bell so you're notified of all future videos. Ta-ta for now. Dun, 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 dun. Hey, moderator. Hi.